welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Our panelists are already lined up, so let's convene tonight's summit. And what a panel do we have for you this evening from Washington, D.C. Joining us, Bradley Bowman, Senior Director at the Center on Military and Political Power, the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, Deputy Editor for the Asia Times, David Goldman, joining us from New York and here in our Tel Aviv studios. One and only Dan Perry, International Affairs Analyst and former Europe Editor at the Associated Press. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for joining us tonight as our main topic. Altitude high, relations low. Will the balloon burst? U.S.-China affairs. Let's take a closer look and pick up the conversation from there.
The balloon may have been shot down, but the hot air from the fallout is just getting started. After an alleged spy balloon was shot down over US airspace earlier this month, Beijing originally denied its involvement, saying it was a weather balloon that went off course. But due to the worsening of diplomatic relations in the weeks following, including US Secretary of State Antony Blinken calling off his visit to Beijing, China has changed its approach, going from defensive to offensive. After originally brushing off the balloon scandal as a performative political act, China has now been accusing the US of hypocrisy, claiming that 10 spy balloons were spotted over China in the last year, accusing the US of wide-scale surveillance on China, while several other balloons were shot down over US airspace over the last few days, the origins of which are unknown. Is the shift in tactic to whataboutism an implication that China did send the original balloon over US airspace? Is the US overreacting? With this issue, on top of mounting tensions between the two nations regarding trade wars and Taiwan, could we be entering a new Cold War? Is there any hope for Chinese-US relations?
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Is there any hope for Chinese-U.S. relations? As always, we begin with our quick-fire round, 30 seconds each to lay out your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick it up from there. So, Mr. Bowman, please take the lead.
Thanks so much. I think we can expect Beijing to continue to advance its goals and protect its interests, and we can expect Washington to do the same. The question is whether the United States, in my view, and its democratic allies and partners understand Beijing's goals, and whether our societies have the will and capability to muster a sufficiently urgent and comprehensive response. That will really determine, I think, the character of the competition between the United States and Beijing, and whether the multi-dimensional campaign Beijing is already waging begins to take on a kinetic component.
Mr. Goldman, your thoughts?
Aircraft carriers are now as vulnerable as battleships were in 1940. We have entirely the wrong kind of military to confront China on its coast. We're massively outgunned, and this was acknowledged in great detail by the Pentagon in its November 29th report on the Chinese military. Given the fact that we cannot fight China over Taiwan or near its borders, and we don't need to fight China anywhere else, the question is, what can we do with China besides fight it? Because we don't wish to do that with our current configuration. Hopefully sanity will prevail and we'll figure out some way to avoid a war with a country that we're not supposed to like, will never like us.
Okay, fair enough there. Dan Perry?
Well, there's hope for anything if you're willing to wait long enough, even for Middle East peace. But right now, the issue is the situation is difficult, and the background is one of simmering tensions in a landscape of potential conflict. I think these two countries have conflicting interests, ideologies, and the issue is even more strategic than economic. And in my view, the variable is China. The U.S., the Trump administration aside, is predictable. China is not.
Okay, and let's please feel free to interact from this point onwards. And allow me to begin by asking you, Mr. Goldman, do you think that the balloon was a deliberate provocation, as in there was a hidden or not so hidden Chinese expectation it would be discovered?
It's very possible the Chinese were testing our air defenses, trying to find out how good our F-22s are. It was a bit embarrassing that it took shooting 3 Sidewinder missiles at this thing to bring it down. So they may have learned something. It's also possible, as some have suggested, that enemies of Xi Jinping internally want to embarrass him by staging a provocation that he would hold the bag for. It's not clear what the military purpose might have been. Remember, China has 68 satellites spying on the United States. They can read the license plate off a military truck. Balloons can give you more information than a satellite because they're closer to Earth, but for Chinese strategic purposes, no one has advanced a conjecture as to what they actually gain in terms of foreign intelligence by doing this kind of thing.
A delay of the Blinken visit. Do you accept the theory that, in fact, the Blinken visit was inconvenient in terms of its
was
timing
meant to
for
be
a variety of
popped.
reasons?
Yeah,
exactly. Yes, right.
Well, Blinken invited himself. He wasn't invited by the Chinese. It's possible they wanted to embarrass him, but we really don't know enough about it to form a judgment. I'm actually confused by the affair, and I would urge a certain amount of caution until we get more facts.
Completely agree.
And if we were lacking any perplexing ingredients here, Mr. Bowman, is the U.S. acting hysterically with the lack of a better phrasing here?
I don't think so. No, certainly that's.
I'm sorry, Mr. Bowman. Excuse me. I heard
No, please feel free to interact. But yeah, Bradley will take the lead. Yeah.
Okay. Certainly, the Chinese Communist Party would like that to be the narrative. If you want to test the legitimacy of that claim, ask yourself, how do you think the Beijing would respond if we had balloons floating over the entire country of China? I think we know exactly what they would do, and it looked quite similar to what the United States did. They would shoot it out of the air. And so, this was a spy balloon from China, the first one I'm referring to, that transited our country and loitered over our intercontinental ballistic missile fields, even as China conducts what our Strategic Command has called a breathtaking modernization expansion of its own nuclear triad. So, I think the silver lining here is it underscored for your average American and middle America, if you will, the reality and tangible nature of what China has been doing for a long time. And that is conducting a comprehensive and systematic campaign to collect as much intelligence as possible in preparation for a potential conflict with the United States and the Taiwan Strait.
It seems almost designed to have delivered that message to the American public in a manner almost comical. And I have to say, I doubt China would have waited for the American balloon to float all the way across the country and over the Pacific. I suspect they would have downed it immediately, regardless of the consequences.
I think you're right. And certainly there was political pressure here in the United States along those lines that we saw manifest itself in the subsequent balloons, regardless of their origin.
Yes.
China's strategic doctrine is, in the case of war with the United States, to bombard us with their 350 hydrogen bombs propelled by ICBMs. We have no defense against that, and no amount of intelligence is going to add or subtract from the fact that our homeland is massively vulnerable. I'm an old Reagan Strategic Defense Initiative guy. I'd like to spend trillions in missile defense, but we're sitting ducks at the moment. The Pentagon, in its November 29th report, said that China can now target with precision any surface vessel out to the Western Pacific, over 1,000 miles from its coast, which means the Navy we have is pretty ineffective, except for a few submarines, in dealing with China on the coast. And that's what we really ought to be concerned about. China has massively invested in capabilities that control its coast and outguns us. That's, in my view, is the great scandal. If the balloon incident makes us worry about that it's a good thing.
Is the U.S. so vulnerable, in your view, that mutual assured destruction no longer applies as it once did with the Soviet Union?
Well, read Admiral Stavridis' wonderful thriller 2034, where the sinking of a U.S. carrier leads to an exchange where a few American and Chinese cities are wiped out by nuclear weapons. That's not an unrealistic scenario. Stavridis was head of the Pacific Command. Mm-hmm. God forbid it happens, but it's something to worry about.
But maybe the U.S. and China are somewhat locked in this destructive codependence mechanism, like the show's host and carbs. You know, it's not a good analogy because carbs do not codepend on me. But is it a cycle here? Beijing and Washington needing one another, and will not let this cycle go.
Well, in
I think
fact,
it's something more than
China in 2007 exported 9% of its GDP to the United States. Its trade with the U.S. is now 2% of GDP. Its massive expansion has been in Asia and the global south. So China is really disentangling itself from the U.S. economy and concentrating its economic expansion in the 700 million people of Southeast Asia and Latin America, Africa, and so forth. So I see the two countries really diverging and having different spheres over time. We will substitute for the strategic goods that we are dependent on from China. We should, and we'll go our own ways.
Bradley Bowman.
I think we should resist the temptation to just, not that your question was necessarily doing that, but to dismiss this as the latest example of history's geopolitical titans wrestling for fleeting advantage. I think it's much more than that. This is the world's leading democracy with all of our perfections, competing with the world's leading authoritarian government to decide who's going to have disproportionate influence for writing the rules of the road. And I think good people of good faith everywhere should not be neutral in this outcome because it's going to have deep impact on freedom, security, and prosperity everywhere. Let's be clear. The Chinese Communist Party would like to remake the international order in its own image. And if you don't like what you're seeing in Xinjiang or the South China Sea or the seas and skies around Taiwan, you won't like a world in which China is calling the shots.
But Bradley Bowman, echoing what Mr. David Goldman said in his opening remarks, is this China-U.S. relationship necessarily a zero-sum game here?
They certainly view it that way. So, we can have touchy-feely talks in the West, but if you read China's own documents, they certainly view it that way. That's why they're trying to create, for example, national champion companies where they acquire our technology in Israel, the United States, and elsewhere, illicitly and illicitly, to put our companies out of business and divert technology to the People's Liberation Army, where they'll use our technology that they got from us to kill our soldiers in a conflict. So can we talk about climate change together and things where we have common interests? Of course we should. Of course we should. But in the end, they want to extinguish the freedom for 25 million people in Taiwan. And if they have the power to do it, they're going to do it.
But do they want to extinguish freedom in the West? That's my question, actually. Because if they were as culturally imperialistic, as you suggest, then that would be their goal. And although I try not to be naive about the intentions of the Chinese Communist Party, I'm not sure that really is their goal. They want influence in Africa.
I missed the first part of your comment there, sorry.
I'm saying, do they really? There's no question.
Yeah.
Please, go ahead.
China is not curious about how barbarians govern themselves. They don't think that we or anyone else is capable of imitating their wonderful meritocratic Mandarin system. We have lousy political systems, and they want to trade with us. They have no ambition to govern anyone else or influence people to be like them because they don't think we're good enough to do it. They really don't care about that. China's policy is much more dangerous than any of that.
Are you sure? Thank God for such cultural arrogance. It's very convenient.
The arrogance is unbelievable. They are trying to hardwire the economies of 3 billion people into the Chinese economic empire, make them dependent on them, and deal with their demographic problem by adding effectively a couple of billion people to the Chinese economy, starting with the 700 million people of Southeast Asia. And they're doing it extremely effectively with, as you pointed out, national champions, telecommunications, broadband as the spearhead.
I think the dependency equation is shifting, but I suspect that'll be something for the second part of the show, right?
Oh, Dan Perry. Thank you for that. My co-host, brother from another mother, David Goldman, Bradley Bowman, and Dan Perry. You're staying with us. Break, and we're back.